Before any decisions get made, the first question that needs to be asked in the Bozeman local government study is, what powers should the city have? There are two options, general powers or self-governing powers. Listen to the following presentation that will explain the differences between the two, and at the end, click the link in the description to take a quick survey to share which one you think the city of Bozeman should have.
Hello, I'm Andrew Thomas with the Gallatin Valley Sentinel. In this talk, I'm going to briefly discuss government powers as they relate to city and municipal governments in Montana. This talk is intended to provide a brief overview of an aspect of city government as it relates to the Bozeman City Charter, but also the work of the Bozeman Study Commission. If you are interested in any specific aspect of this talk, I would encourage you to first review the Bozeman City Charter and also look into the work of the Bozeman Study Commission. The Study Commission is currently reviewing the Bozeman City Charter to formulate whether or not any changes in Bozeman city government need to occur. And they're also seeking public input regarding how Bozeman city government can be more responsive to the needs of the people. So power or legal authority refers to the ability of a government or individual to do things. The power of a local or municipal government to do things is granted by both the state and federal constitutions. Local governments cannot exceed the powers granted by the state or federal constitution. So there's known as, or what is known as, the supremacy clause. So state governments cannot exceed what the federal government dictates, and city governments cannot exceed what the state government dictates in their constitutions. Currently, the Montana Constitution allows for either general or self-governing powers. Currently, the city of Bozeman is a self-governing municipality, and the city charter defines how those powers are exercised. So the two types of powers that occur under the Montana Constitution are general powers, which essentially describe a situation where you can only do what the legislature specifically lets you do. So you have no power beyond what the legislature grants you in terms of authority. And then there are self-governing powers. So a way of describing self-governing powers is you can do anything not prohibited by state law. Section 4 of the Montana Constitution describes general powers. So a local government unit without self-government powers has the following general powers. An incorporated city or town has the powers of a municipal corporation and legislative, administrative, and other powers provided or implied by law. A county has legislative, administrative, and other powers provided or implied by law. Other local government units have powers provided by law. The powers of incorporated cities and towns and counties shall be liberally construed. So the two important words to keep in mind here are implied and liberally construed. So if the Constitution implies a power, it does not necessarily need to specifically state that a city government has that power. Additionally, if the court or another governing body is reviewing a power, it will liberally, that is, generously construe that power to favor the city or municipal government. Montana Code Annotated 7-1-4123 deals with legislative powers under general powers. So a municipality with general powers has legislative power subject to the provisions of state law to adopt, amend, and repeal ordinances and resolutions required to preserve peace and order and secure freedom from dangerous or noxious activities, secure and promote the general public health and welfare, provide any service or perform any function authorized or required by state law, exercise any power granted by state law, subject to Montana Code Annotated 15-10-420, levy any tax authorized by state law for public or governmental purposes described in Montana Code Annotated 7-6-2527. Appropriate public funds, impose a special assessment reasonably related to the cost of any special service or special benefit provided by the municipality, or impose a fee for the provision of a service, grant franchises, and provide for its own organization and management of its government affairs. Section 2 of the Montana Constitution deals with issues of self-government. Generally speaking, the people have the exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state. They may alter or abolish the Constitution and form of government whether they deem it necessary. Now, an important aspect of powers under the Montana Constitution as they apply to city or municipal governments is the concept of home rule versus shared powers. So home rule means that specific powers granted to local government or limiting the power of the legislature to intervene in local affairs. So if a municipal government has home rule, the legislature or other governmental entity cannot come in and say, local government, you should do what we say you should do. We have power over you. The jurisdiction or the power to make rules under home rule lies exclusively with that municipal or city government. Whereas with shared powers, all powers except those that are prohibited, local policy can be preempted by the legislature. So if a local government passes a regulation under shared powers and the legislature does not like that policy, it can negate the local policy. It has the ability to affect local governmental power. So the city of Bozeman has shared powers, which means it can do anything other than what is prohibited by the legislature. So Section 6, Article 6 of the Montana Constitution states that a local government unit adopting a self-government charter may exercise any power not prohibited by this Constitution, law, or charter. So essentially, Section 6, Article 6 of the Montana State Constitution gives power to local governments to do almost anything that is not explicitly prohibited by the state constitution. So some examples of permitted and prohibited city powers. So some permitted city powers include lawfully acquiring and operating utilities such as gas or electric within and outside the boundaries of its jurisdiction, implementing local development or impact fees, requiring all residents to connect to city water supply, also creating a tenant right to counsel program. Now, prohibited city powers include things such as establishing a rate or price otherwise determined by a state agency. So this relates to things like utility prices. Also having the power to impose a duty on another unit of local government. So one governmental entity cannot create a duty or a tax on another governmental entity without state authorization. Now, some aspects of the Bozeman City Charter that relate to powers. And again, I would encourage you to review the entire charter. Section 1.01 denotes the general powers of the city. So the city of Bozeman shall have all powers possible for a city with self-governing powers to have under the Constitution and laws of the state of Montana as fully and completely as though they were specifically enumerated in this charter. So the Bozeman City Charter notes that Bozeman city government has the maximum power to create programs or policies that are not expressly limited by the Montana state constitution. Section 1.02 deals with issues of construction. So powers. The powers of the city under this charter shall be construed liberally in favor of the city, and the specific mention of particular powers in the charter shall not be construed as limiting in any way the general powers granted in this article. So again, the construction of the city charter favors the city's interpretation of what powers it has. Therefore, if a community member disagrees with the city's construction, the only recourse that that community member has is to somehow prove that the city charter is unconstitutional. So again, city powers under the current Bozeman City Charter are very liberally construed and generously favor the city. Priority construction, as provided by Article 6, Section 5 of the Constitution of Montana, provisions herein establishing executive, legislative, and administrative structure and organization are superior to statutory provisions. Section 1.03 deals with intergovernmental relations. The city of Bozeman may participate by contract or otherwise with any governmental entity of the state of Montana or any other state or states in the United States in performance of any activity which one or more of such entities has the authority to undertake. So this provision in the city charter allows for Bozeman city government to enter into intergovernmental agreements with other governmental entities. Section 2-01 of the charter deals with general powers and duties. All powers of the city shall be vested in the city commission except as otherwise provided by law or this charter, and the commission shall provide for the exercise thereof and for the performance of all duties and obligations imposed on the city by law. So under the current Bozeman City Charter, the city commission has most of the authority to, one, create, but also delegate powers of Bozeman city government as it sees fit. Now, some pros and cons of general powers. In terms of pros or advantages, general powers have certain advantages. One, they place stronger limits on local government. So since local governments are constrained by the permissions of the state in terms of their powers, which are still quite broad, there are certain limits on what local governments can do. They also result in increased predictability and stability because local governments have to conform to what is generally considered permissible under state law. Also, they result in more state oversight and accountability. Now, in terms of cons or drawbacks, general powers result in reduced flexibility for local solutions. So if a local government wants to come up with a unique solution to its problems, and that somehow disagrees with what the interpretation of local powers are under the state constitution, then the local government may not do that. It also shifts power upwards to the state. So the state has a greater role in dictating local policy. It may also slow innovation to solve local problems because perceivably the only way that a non-delegated power can be included under the general powers is for the legislature to somehow change the state constitution and state regulations regarding that particular power. Now, in terms of pros and cons as they relate to self-governing powers, the pros are that self-governing powers have greater flexibility to address local issues. Also, they have the ability to innovate through new types of policies. Now, in terms of drawbacks, self-governing powers have a higher risk of government overreach. And they can also create new entitlement programs that residents may not agree with. So, one thing to keep in mind with governmental powers, especially under self-governing powers, but general powers as well, is that regulations by governments, unless they relate to dealing with members of a protected class, so regulations relating to race, religion, national origin, and so on, general regulations relating to economic regulation or regulations not targeting members of a protected class fall under the constitutional standard of what is known as rational basis. So rational basis is very permissive of government regulation. And what rational basis basically says is that so long as a government can articulate a rationale, that is a logical justification for a government policy, it may enact that policy. Now, the rationale does not even need to correspond to reality. It simply has to be rationally or logically related to the goals of a policy. So, especially with self-governing policies, this is a major drawback. So, a government theoretically can have a very loose rationale for a policy and implement that policy with no concern for its cost or its effect on individuals' economic welfare or their well-being. And under one, the state constitution, but also the federal constitution, there really isn't anything that local citizens can do to challenge that, perceivably irrational or inefficient policy. So, based upon this brief discussion of government powers, here are a couple of questions that you should carefully consider and try to answer so as to better help you understand, one, what powers Bozeman city government should consider having, but also how specifically the study commission should deal with issues of powers if it is to revise the Bozeman City Charter. So the first question, should Bozeman keep using self-governing powers or should it change to general powers? If Bozeman city government keeps self-governing powers, what self-governing powers should Bozeman city government have? Finally, what limits on self-governing powers should be applied to city government? So again, I would encourage you to review the specific materials that are included in the study commission's work, as well as the Bozeman City Charter. And also think of examples of your interactions with Bozeman city government and the powers that it has developed, and whether or not those powers should be modified in the revision of the current Bozeman City Charter.
Thank you for listening. We hope this presentation helped you to understand the differences between general powers and self-governing powers, and why this decision between the two options is the first that needs to be made in the local government study process. Please take a quick few minutes and follow the link in the description to tell us what powers you think the City of Bozeman should have, and stay tuned for our next installment coming soon.